Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education, Dr. Carmel Roof, who this evening represents the Dean of the Faculty, Professor Sylvia Cohenberg, members of the Department of Literatures in English, or distinguished Professor Emeritus Edward Baugh and Mrs. Baugh, guest speaker for today's distinguished lecture, Professor Alison Donnell, specially invited guests present in the physical space with us here at the UWI Mona campus, and viewers from across the globe in the virtual space. We are thrilled to be able to welcome you to the 15th Edward Baugh Distinguished Lecture, hosted by the Department of Literatures in English, UWI Mona. This evening is particularly special for those of us who are here physically because we are able to host this event in a hybrid fashion rather than solely through a virtual space, something that has not happened in a little over 2 years. This event remains one of the department's signature events because of all it represents and offers to a wide cross-section of individuals engaged in Caribbean studies, literary studies, language and communication, and West Indian poetry. Held in honor of Professor Emeritus Edward Baugh, who has created a highly valued space for Caribbean scholars across diverse fields through his poetic writings and scholarly contributions on West Indian literature and poetry across decades of Caribbean literary history. This annual event is one which constantly allows us as professionals and as a community of writers, scholars, and teachers to truly experience Caribbean literature. It creates the opportunity to establish the importance of Caribbean literature through our focus on the area and the sharing of our experiences in the area. Many of us in here today have either been his students or have worked with him in a variety of contexts and have had a solid experience of his presence, his impact, and the profound legacy he continues to leave for those of us who engage in Caribbean literary criticism and Caribbean poetry. Professor Baugh, we are so profoundly grateful and elated that you could be present today, and we really want to start this distinguished lecture by thanking you for all you have contributed and given to us professionally and personally, to the students, the lecturers, the scholars, the readers, the poets, and literary critics who continue also to play a part in creating and developing the rich areas of Caribbean literary studies. Absolutely. The department is also delighted to have as the speaker of this 15th distinguished lecture, Professor Alison Donnell, who has produced several publications on Caribbean literature and engaged post-colonial scholars across the globe in critical conversations on Caribbean literature and Caribbean literary history, and who has also specifically responded to the critical literary work of Edward Baugh. We are happy that Professor Donnell accepted our invitation to be the speaker for this 15th Edward Baugh Distinguished Lecture, and we look forward to what promises to be a stimulating, inspiring, and thought-provoking presentation entitled The Missing Mid-Century Woman Writer and Another Quarrel with History. I now call on Deputy Dean of the Faculty, Dr. Carmel Roof, to offer greetings from the faculty, after which Dr. Isis Simaj Hall, lecturer in the Department of Literatures in English, will formally introduce our speaker, Professor Donnell.
Dr. Aisha Spencer, Acting Head of Department of Literatures in English, Emeritus Professor Edward Baugh, and Mrs. Baugh, Professor Donnell, specially invited guests, lecturers of the department, other colleagues, students, those here physically in the room and online, good evening. As I bring greeting on behalf of Professor Sylvia Cohenberg, I would like to express thank you to the Department of Literatures in English for preserving the legacy of Caribbean scholarship through the celebration of Professor Edward Baugh's literary contribution and influence as a Caribbean poet and literary critic. This 15th distinguished lecture is a reminder that it is on the shoulders of these stalwarts that we stand as Caribbean people. It is a reminder that their work paved the way for those of us who enter international spaces to be recognized and stand tall. Additionally, it is through the celebration of scholars such as Professor Baugh that the Faculty of Humanities and Education reminds new members and staff and emerging scholars of the wider university of the rich legacy that we are now a part of. The Faculty of Humanities and Education, through the Department of Literatures in English, is indeed honored to have this opportunity to draw attention and to draw everyone's attention to the well-respected and outstanding contribution of Professor Baugh. Professor Baugh, the Faculty of Humanities and Education honors your scholarship as recognition of excellence. I would also like to draw our attention to a piece he wrote for the Anthony Sabga Caribbean Awards for Excellence, entitled The Habit of Excellence. And in the piece, he stated, "We're all the better for it if the habit of excellence is cultivated even in the most humble and routine duties and understandings." Those were wise words and continue to remain wise words. So as we host this lecture, this is another reminder of the faculty's role in the pursuance of excellence. As a faculty, we are of the view that it is the pursuance of excellence that will help us to unearth new knowledge and understanding about ourselves as people in the West Indies. Professor Donnell, I must say the title of your lecture is quite intriguing and stimulating. I had some wonderings as I read the title over and over. And so like others, I'm anxiously waiting to hear your talk on the missing mid-century West Indian woman writer and another quarrel with history. I think that latter part is really quite stimulating. I look forward to the expert knowledge you will share with us and from which I'm sure we will all benefit. Distinguished attendees, on behalf of Professor Cowenberg, the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education, thank you for joining us this evening. We hope that as you listen and participate, you will be inspired and you will leave with improved understanding, and that your analytical and creative abilities will be stimulated to take some form of action in your own space or in your own place. Best wishes to everyone for a thought-provoking and enriching lecture. Thank you.
More words. Hello, everyone. As I introduce Professor Alison Donnell today, I must start by acknowledging Professors Emeriti Evelyn O'Callaghan and Carolyn Cooper, who is watching online. Their work on West Indian women writers like Eliza Fenwick, Mariah Nugent, Jean Reese, Phyllis Shand Alfrey, Elliot Bliss, and a poet-performer like Louise Bennett, or a figure like Nanny of the Maroons, or the feminist politics of the Kuni Jama Uman, respectively, of course, are the bedrock of Professor Donnell's gendered examinations of West Indian women's writing, historical or otherwise. So thank you to Drs. Cooper and O'Callaghan for setting the groundwork. As a scholar of Caribbean literature myself, I am overjoyed to introduce Professor Donnell today, as she is a scholar whose work has greatly shaped and influenced my own. She comes to us as the head of the School of Literature, Drama, and Creative Writing at the University of East Anglia, and she has a publication record that is more than impressive. She has works ranging from her most recent monograph, Creolized Sexualities, Undoing Heteronormativity in the Literary Imagination of the Anglo-Caribbean, which was published by Rutgers Press in 2021, to Caribbean-Irish Connections, co-edited with Evelyn O'Callaghan and Maria McGarity, and published by the University of the West Indies Press in 2015. To her various publications with Routledge Press, to her work on Una Marson, that was published by People Tree, or any of her many journal articles and book chapters. Professor Donnell has published on queer studies, sexuality, gender, and Caribbean feminism. As a Caribbean literature scholar, she has contributed greatly to the field of literary history, to culture, and the archive. And she has been doing the very critical work of making unseen West Indian women authors visible. Beyond research, Professor Donnell's passion for contemporary creative writing is evident in her years of serving as chair of directors for the international literary magazine Wasafari. Today, Professor Donnell will deliver the 15th annual Edward Baugh Distinguished Lecture. The title of her talk is The Missing Mid-Century West Indian Woman Writer and Another Quarrel with History. Now, I will not belabor this introduction any longer, except to say this. It seems absolutely crucial to an appreciation of Caribbean women's writing that women are restored not only as writers, but in all their historical dimensions, as slaves, as rebels, as mothers, as workers. The absence of an open conversation between feminist historiographers and literary critics until very recently seems to underwrite the neglect of Caribbean women in the accounts of history. As with the denial of literary and intellectual foremothers, the question is not, in fact, one of absence, but simply one of disconnection. End quote. Those were Professor Donnell's words, written in her 2006 critical text, 20th Century Caribbean Literature. And in today's distinguished lecture, we can be confident that she will show us exactly how and why we must reconnect to the Caribbean women writers who have not been absent from history, but have been noticeably ignored in the scholarship until now. No longer will women writers be virtually abandoned, to borrow a phrase from Betty Wilson and Pamela Mordecai. Today, we can be grateful that Professor Donnell is here to quarrel with history and amplify the voices of our mid-century women writers. So thank you for joining us today, Professor Alison Donnell, and welcome to all.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Obviously, I'd also like to begin by thanking Dr. Spencer and indeed the whole department at Mona for this invitation. It is truly an honour and a privilege to be asked to deliver this distinguished Edward Baugh lecture. I'm a bit shorter than everyone else, thank you. Being here at Mona in 2020 also feels like a special moment, because it was at Mona 30 years ago that I delivered my first ever paper on Caribbean literature at the 1992 ACLAS conference. Thankfully, there was an overwhelming positive response, and I was subsequently invited to Carolyn Cooper's home, which felt like a baptism into what has subsequently become my intellectual community and my community for 3 decades. And while my qualifications as a Caribbeanist are stamped the University of Warwick, the University of the West Indies has played a hugely influential role in my education and my continued development as a critic. As an undergraduate student at Warwick, I took a special option on Caribbean literature taught by the Guyanese critic Michael Gilkes, then on an exchange from Cave Hill. And later, during my doctoral studies, Professor Kenneth Ramchan was at Warwick and encouraged me to work on women's writing, also acting, of course, as a magnificent human archive himself. I later worked with both Professor O'Callaghan and Professor Cooper on collaborative projects, and with Michael Buckner at the University of West Indies. It was back then that I first encountered the work of Professor Baugh, And although I've never had the pleasure, or I imagine the challenge, to be formally educated by him, I have genuinely been in conversation with his work for my whole career. As the vast majority of people listening to this lecture will recognise, my title today plays off the title of Professor Baugh's 1977 essay, The West Indian Writer and His Quarrel with History, but shifts the argument towards a quarrel within West Indian literary history around the persistent invisibility or disconnection of the mid-20th century woman writer. When the journal Small Axe republished Professor Baugh's essay in 2012, I was invited to respond as part of a roundtable forum. Professor Baugh also had the right to reply and noted that if he were writing the paper in the 1990s, the word his would not have been in the title. Acknowledging the role of women's writing, Professor Baugh continued by saying that Paula Marshall's The Chosen Place, Timeless People would have been included in his account of important meta-historical writings. Nobody who has read that novel would quarrel with that inclusion. But in terms of literary history, bringing Marshall in alongside Lamming, Naipaul and Walcott does unwittingly reaffirm the seeming belatedness of women's writing. I've written before about the persistent myth of a double spontaneous genesis for West Indian literature, 1950s in London for male writers and 1980s Jamaica for women. And although there is increasing evidence against these crude chronologies, the sense of a temporal distance between writing by men and women is still often assumed. This has always bothered me, as a feminist for sure, but also as a scholar. And I've given a lot of time to thinking about the relationship between Caribbean literature and its literary histories, how those are determined and how this field, so alert to the biases of colonial historiography, may have accrued its own dominant histories that give good ground for more helpful quarrels. During my long, meeting-free, wonderful days of doctoral research in the early 1990s, I would settle down between the stacks of the Caribbean literature section of Warwick University Library and read my way through their collection of little magazines, pamphlets and works published locally, as well as the metropolitan anthologies and single publication authors by authors I'd been taught for my undergraduate study. What struck me then was a huge gulf between these two versions of West Indian literary culture. While, of course, it's perfectly normal to feel this researcher vertigo at the beginning of a doctoral project, what was unusual was how little acknowledgement there was of that gulf, and how invisible the busy, diverse world of local writers was in the post-1965 anthologies I had encountered, and the majority of critical studies that followed. What I wanted to express then, and what has driven all my work since, is that mismatch between what is curated, circulated, critiqued as the literary field's Caribbean literature, and what actually constitutes the field, how partial our accounts are, why we mistake the map for the ground, and what we might lose as a result. In particular, I've always been intrigued by the seeming invisibility of women writers at the mid-20th century, just that very moment when West Indian literature has been recorded as booming. If I hadn't fallen into academia, I would have liked to have trained as a detective, honestly. And looking back, I suspect that I've always been part academic and part literary detective. The women writers missing from this period have haunted me for decades. I've had lists of their names in Word files and notebooks, and as information has surfaced, I've made documents for some and folders even for others. I actually wanted to buy a 1950s filing cabinet or two and name an empty folder for each writer to materialise their loss, but that was going a little too far even for my endlessly tolerant husband. So when I was awarded significant project funding from the Leverhulme Trust to research the gaps between 1930 and 1980, I was overjoyed at the prospect of a team of researchers filling pages, chapters, and then books with their names, working out why they were almost invisible, finding out if their literary sensibilities would engage us today, and if there were more published and unpublished works to accompany the often slight but talented offerings I had managed to find. I envisaged that most of my time would be spent gathering and analysing primary archival material from research trips to the Caribbean. But shortly after my funded leave started, COVID changed everything. All travel was banned and all archives were closed. I cried a lot. I felt so defeated, but necessity truly is the mother of invention, and it turns out that quite different journeys and new places of encounter lay ahead. I won't have time today to offer the kind of detailed analysis that could persuade you of the literariness of the three writers I'm going to present. So I'm hoping you'll trust me when I say that I believe these women would have enriched the anthologies of the 1960s, through which the inventory of West Indian, Anglophone Caribbean writing was most powerfully constituted. There's a slide, I think, just to give you a sense of what those anthologies were. And not a single one of those included a piece of women's writing. And that I also believe that in their future inclusion is possible in literary histories, the writing by these women will make all kinds of new connections among and across generations, and national literatures and regional thematics and formal trends possible. The first writer I'd like to present is a Jamaican, Ada Quail. Thanks. Who it turns out was hiding in plain sight in the cluster of 1950s West Indian novelists published by London houses. With her fabulously alluring name, Ada Quail was always in my sights. I first saw her novel The Mistress listed in the author bibliography that accompanies Kenneth Ramchand's landmark 1970 study, The West Indian Novel and Its Background, although there was no mention of the work itself in the critical discussion. I recognised that she was an important and intriguing outlier in what little I knew of mid-20th century West Indian women's writing. She'd written a novel rather than short stories, and it had been published by McGibbon and Key in London in 1957. When I finally obtained a copy, the novel itself was intriguing and unusual, narrating the dramatic twists and turns in fortunes and passions of plantation mistresses in Jamaica in the early 20th century as the First World War raged in Europe. It focuses on the life of Laura Pettigrew, who inherits her mother's plantation just ahead of her 16th birthday. The writing is unusually explicit in its account of female erotic desire, and alongside its depictions of Creole delirium and brutality, it gestures at ground-up transitions in belonging and control towards the African-descended population whose intimate knowledge of the land enables them to outsmart the conceited fictions of racialized superiority. But I had no leads on the mysterious Ada, other than a response to a post about the mistress by Jen McDerra on the Twitter feed for our Caribbean Literary Heritage Project. When my trip to Jamaica was cancelled, I reached out to Philippa Bainbridge for any more information she might be able to share about her aunt. We began a correspondence that deepened with telephone conversations and eventually an outdoor COVID-safe visit with Philippa and Ada's grandson too. I learnt then that Kathleen Louise Woods, née Robinson, had written under a pen name so, to quote, as not to scandalise her family at the time. Yet the intended discretion of a pseudonym had become an invisibility cloak by the end of the century. All the same, reaching back to mid-century sources, it became evident that the mistress was firmly part of a London West Indian literary scene. McGibbon and Key published a number of novels by the acclaimed Trinidadian writer Samuel Selvon, alongside prominent sociological studies of the Caribbean region by Orlando Patterson and Gordon K. Lewis. And John LaRose attributed his friendship with James McGibbon to his confidence in becoming a publisher when establishing New Beacon Books in 1966. In common with the novels published by these male contemporaries, Quail's The Mistress was widely reviewed in the UK press. Although mainly positive about her literary power and the Creole language of the book's dialogue, there is also a demonstrably gendered language at work in these reviews that name the novel as powerful, vivid, lurid, without inhibition. 3 reviews by fellow West Indian writers stand out as being of particular significance in understanding how The Mistress was received within this emerging field. Barbadian Frank Collymore, who was such a powerful tastemaker as the editor of BIM and in his collaboration with Henry Swansea, producer of the Caribbean Voices programme, reviews The Mistress as, to quote, a harsh novel, but written with considerable skill and power. While Collymore makes no direct reference to this novel as a piece of women's writing, he does signal the gendering of the central storyline and how Laura's downfall is linked to her, quote, selecting a callous Baugh for a lover. In Sylvia Winter's 1958 review article, Quail is listed alongside Edgar Mittelholzer, V.S. Reid, Samuel Selvon, Roger Mace, George Lamming, John Hearn, V.S. Naipaul, and Jan Carew as Caribbean novelists, quote, living and writing in London and sharing a common polyglot racial background. After crediting The Mistress as a competent historical piece, Winter frustratingly devotes the remainder of her article to the male writers, though she does mistakenly designate Quail as the first woman novelist from the Caribbean. The most engaged review of The Mistress comes from Samuel Selvon and takes an altogether more energetic and positive tone as he welcomes Quail to the community of West Indian writers in Britain and affirms her standing. To quote, to the list of already established authors must now be added prominently the name of Ada Quail, not only because she is the first woman writer from those parts to appear on the scene, but because she comes with the first novel so swiftly moving and highly readable as to ensure her a warm welcome by her contemporaries. Selvon's closing comments, Ada Quail has come upon the scene with colours flying high and is already at work on her second book, suggest to me that they had possibly met or at least spoken to each other. So while all the signs from the early reception of The Mistress indicate that Quail was part of what we now call the Windrush generation, there is scant attention to it or to her in any subsequent studies of Caribbean literature. Why then? The information provided by the publisher McGibbon and Key introduces the reader to Ada Quail, daughter of a banana planter, and explains that some of her multiple ancestors had come from Britain in the 17th century. The question of whether it was Wood's decision to stress her British ancestry or the publisher's cannot be answered. But given that Planter is still coded as white, as well as the novel's central interest in the white plantation mistress, it's perhaps not surprising that in her few cameo appearances in the critical field of Caribbean women's writing that began to take stronger shape from the 1980s, The Mistress has largely been taken to be a novel about white West Indianness written by a white West Indian. This entanglement of literary value with ancestral claim that had become a major site of contestation in the debates over the place of the white Dominican writer Jean Rhys possibly cast a shadow over The Mistress too. When Elaine Campbell engages with the novel in 1982, it is to put Winter right on her dates, to champion instead Rhys's 1934 novel Voyage in the Dark and Phyllis Shandolfra's 1953 The Orchid House, and ultimately to bring to attention Elma Napier, another Dominican woman writer. Campbell dismisses The Mistress mainly on account that, to quote, the author's knowledge of West Indian culture is not adequately displayed. When she argues that, to quote, the Orchid House's primacy to The Mistress is unexceptionable, and Olfra's West Indian ancestry, which she traces for 200 years in Dominica, firmly fixes her candidacy as a West Indian woman novelist. The role that authenticity, but also rivalry, play in her literary historiography become clear. A more inclusive approach comes at the cusp of the 21st century in Elizabeth Parafusini-Gilbert's 1997 essay, Exploring Decolonizing Feminism, the Homegrown Roots of Caribbean Women's Movements. Here, Quail's novel heads up an impressive list of literary works identified for their, to quote, salient elements of an emerging female and feminist historiography that seeks to examine the parameters of Caribbean feminism from a vantage point that is truly Caribbean and appears to owe little to foreign concepts of women's power. Listed alongside Paula Marshall's The Chosen Place, The Timeless People, Michelle Cliff's Abeng and No Telephone to Heaven, Elizabeth Nunes When Rocks Dance, and Phyllis Shandolfra's The Orchid House, The Mistress is an excellent literary company again. Yet, as Parafasini Gibert develops her argument, the mistress is stranded once more, and as in Winter's piece, it's initially named but left completely uninterrogated. It's not until Evelyn O'Callaghan's 2004 study, Women Writing the West Indies, 1804 to 1939, A Hot Place Belonging to Us, that there is any sustained attempt to read this novel within a tradition of West Indian writing. But again, the novel falls just out of the remit and chronology of that work, and so the analysis is brief. What this pattern of referencing Quail only to reconfirm her peripherality suggests, I think, is that the mistress has been consistently difficult to place. Within a Windrush generation that was seemingly male, within a body of work produced by white Creole writers with whom she was mistakenly identified, and with a later body of feminist historical novelists. During a period when the shaping of Caribbean literary history was competitive and often conflictual, the mistress was sidelined due to its nonconformity. Soon after, copies of the novel became obscure and peripherality slid into invisibility. Yet Ada, or Kathleen, was historically significant. She was the only West Indian woman whose novel was published and read in the same orbit as a Windrush male's. The mistress was circulated as part of the Boots Book Lovers Library and paperbacked in 1971, and she had been on an extraordinary journey to achieve this literary success. In common with the other women I've been trying to recover, Kathleen was clearly exceptional. Her father, William Robertson, was a teacher of African descent, and her mother, Lillian Anderson, was of European descent and the daughter of a banana planter. As I found out from Philippa, the family kept a rather grandly named house, Balmoral, in Wood Park, Pembroke Hall, as well as a townhouse in Kingston, where Kathleen was educated, almost certainly at Walmer's Girls' School. At the age of just 22, Kathleen left Jamaica and crossed to New York, then to Liverpool, during the Battle of the Atlantic, to become possibly the first Jamaican woman to be signed into the WAF. She met her husband, Morris Woods, while serving, and moved to Kenya from Egypt to marry and live with him. Not long after Una Marson hosted Calling the West Indies for the BBC, Kathleen was involved in East Africa Calling. She also contributed to Woman's Hour in the UK, as well as writing for a newspaper in Nairobi. Her work as a journalist, which she continued in Britain, was in common with that of many West Indian writers of that period, but she was also a wife and a mother in mid-century Britain, with all its post-war expectations of heteropatriarchal stability. As the author biog in The Dust Jacket of the hardback novel notes, Kathleen, quote, returned to Britain with a sheaf of manuscripts and a husband. Bringing up a son has hitherto impeded her writing, but she is now busy fulfilling her only ambition, to be a good novelist. Yet, if Kathleen is present to, and then absented from, the metropolitan locus of West Indian writing, celebrated and dominant in West Indian literary histories, then Edwina Melville, with whom she shares the ambition to be recognised as a professional writer, a career spanning journalism and fiction, and a life balancing her writing with maternal responsibilities, was geographically remote from the hubbub of London, and definitely never entered the green room at the Langham Hotel to chat with Sam Selvon. And yet, living in the Rupununi savannas of Guyana, she too managed to make something of a name for herself. I first heard the name Edwina Melville from Henry Swansea, the producer of the Caribbean Voices programme in the 1950s, with whom I corresponded in the early 1990s, when my dreaming in the library stacks commonly provoked letters to anyone I thought might be able to tell me more about the women. I asked Mr. Swansea which women writers he thought I should follow up on, and Edwina was given special attention. To quote, "Far away on the high savannas of the Rupununi in Guyana, there was a particular favourite of mine, a girl called Edwina Melville, who was the only writer to send material direct to London. I often wonder what happened to her. She was married to the Melville clan on the borders of Venezuela, against whom Forbes Burnham sent 3 planeloads of troops to smoke them out." Swansea's admiration and affection for Edwina is not in question. All the same, his mention of this formidable woman as a girl and married to the Melville clan shrinks and skews the frame of her as a serious writer. His wistful remark about what happened to her almost confirms his sense that her writing career would be transient, impossible to sustain. Melville had four short pieces broadcast on the BBC between 1953 and 1955. When I read the scripts of the stories, I was utterly bowled over. Her writing was rooted in the specificity of its place, so sensitive to the environment, so compassionate, so inclusive. In terms of its intimate ecological sensibility, its characterization, and also its language, switching from Standard English to Wapishana to Creole. From researching her lively correspondence with Swansea, I learnt that Edwina had serious ambitions as a writer. In 1953, she is asking him if he will accept a longer piece to be broadcast in 2 parts, or if she can send 2 or 3 short stories of, to quote, wildlife, true. In a later letter, Swansea refers to her magnus opus about her life, evidently picking up on their conversation about a longer work. Although in 1954 Swansea returns her poems, suggesting she needs to work on her technique, he was clearly impressed by her writing, and in September of that year, her exquisite short story, The Voice, was published in the BBC's London Calling magazine, perhaps a parting gift as Swansea left the programme that year. It was certainly an important gesture of support and recognition, though of a different order to the unofficial agent work he undertook for male writers. And when Edwina asks for his advice on publishing venues, he suggests that she sends her work to the Queen or Good Housekeeping, whom he believes will be interested to hear about, to quote, your daily life as a woman in a remote place. Swansea's sense of Edwina was very much as a woman writer. Yet it was clear to me from the correspondence that Edwina would have published elsewhere, or at least made attempts to. I looked at both of Swansea's recommended venues, but couldn't find her writing there. Unlike Ada, there was no mention of Edwina in the critical record, and I could find only very few works of hers in Kike Overall and A.J. Seymour anthology. But when an eBay search came up with one story published under the name Edwina Melville, called The Waiting Land, I had another lead, not to Good Housekeeping, but to the prestigious literary Blackwoods magazine in Edinburgh, a venue recognised for supporting serious literary talent. I took a punt on another eBay Blackwoods story by E.M. called The Girl in Green, published in 1965, while I followed up with the National Library of Scotland on Blackwoods archives. I was richly rewarded by not only a third piece of writing, Wapishana Village, published in 1957, but by some wonderful correspondence from Edwina to Captain Blackwood. Swansea may have seen himself as her champion and wondered what happened to her when he was no longer at the BBC, but Edwina had moved on. She sent her story, The Waiting Land, to Blackwood in July of 1955, and he accepts it with speed. Aiming high and succeeding has seemingly boosted her confidence, and in August of 55, she tells Captain Blackwood in her vivacious, guileless manner, I hope one day to break into the literary world with a bestseller full of stories or a story about this country and its people. While most of us are familiar with the stories of how literally sustaining the BBC writer fees were, Edwina's own story here is more particular. She confides in the captain, I will soon be adding another member to our family tree. I must tell you how terribly useful the pocket money from the manuscript you accepted will come in. We have no doctors up here, and Georgetown, the city with its hospitals, is reached by plane. I was very worried with only my husband to help me, but now I shall be able to go down to town. There is so much in here that accounts of literary history find hard to carry, and yet it matters, to me at least, to think of Edwina sending out her stories with gifted stamps while juggling family life in the Rupunini in the same year that Lamming published The Emigrants in London. Her life, so different, so distant to his, yet her Caribbean experience also so luminously rendered in an unquestionably literary venue in Britain. Because I had only managed to acquire Edwina's stories as literary orphans, cut free from their binding and sold off individually by eBay merchants indifferent to their historical value, It was only in the archives that I discovered that her story, The Girl in Green, had won second prize in the Blackwood competition of 1964. I doubt that this is what Swansea would have imagined had happened to her. And following his narrative, I too had conjectured that Melville was likely invisible to contemporary literary history on account of being so remote to networks and institutions. But in fact, here she was telling Captain Blackwood how she was amazed, stunned with joy, and how her prize had broken her depression, brought about by managing the household alone while her husband was away. Here then was a mid-century West Indian woman writer, writing with talent and charm about exactly the kind of Caribbean world that was being celebrated in London, and winning second prize in the competition of a literary journal published in Edinburgh from 1817 with an established role in literary history. I so wanted to know more about this amazing woman. Every detail I found out about her, including that she was the first woman to have a tractor license in Guyana, made her more tantalizing than ever. Through a newspaper advertisement and various leads, I'd made brief contact with her sons, still based in the Rupununi, but I'd more or less given up on finding the kind of relation who'd made all the difference in my research on other writers. Then, just last month, I posted my draft Wikipedia entry on Edwina into my wiki sandbox, and thanks only to a biographical error, I found Edwina's daughter, Donnell. Fortuitously, she spotted my error and contacted her cousin, John Simone, to see if he might edit the entry. Happily, John contacted me, and through him I managed to connect to Donnell and to learn so much more about her remarkable mother, including that she was a cub reporter for the Guyana Chronicle when she travelled to the Rupununi and met Charles Melville, who was a widowed rancher 20 years her senior. They were married in 1950 and had 5 children. Edwina bridged the occupations of the other women I have researched so far, in that she was both teacher and journalist. While working in the government office in Leatham, Edwina started a small local newspaper called Rupununi Roundup. And beside government news, she would write stories for this paper and also write down the stories that villagers told her, printing them in their names, insisting that they were their stories. In the mid-1950s, she moved with her children to Ashton, where she taught the Wapishana children and collected their stories. Later in life, Edwina was a Member of Parliament for the Rupununi District, Region 9. Sadly, she did not write her magnus opus or a bestseller. She only cleared time for her own story to be released at the very end of her life and did not live to complete the task. The only book-length piece I know of to date is This is the Rupununi, a study in the lives of the people published by the Government Information Service. Ultimately, Edwina's literary ambitions were balanced with her political commitments to her people and her place. Her energies were focused in making its wonders known and in protecting them. Indeed, if her writing demonstrates an acute sensitivity to the rich ecology of the rainforest, Edwina was also an early environmental activist. In the mid-1980s, she was a guest speaker at the United Auto Workers Union convention in California, where she highlighted the destruction caused by foreign companies who were coming to Guyana to look for gold. In some sense, Edwina's invisibility speaks to multiple issues around sources: the fact that the Caribbean Voices scripts were never published, the fact that literary historians, like all other historians, behave like Shevchenko's dog in the forest and simply follow what's been marked before. But there's also something about the framing of her as a woman writer that can't be ignored. And Edwina was arguably less visible because she was not as invested in being recognised as a writer as much as she was in representing the place and people she called home. Fortunately, while lots of her papers were lost during the Rupununi Revolution, a significant amount of unpublished work remains in her children's hands, and I'm so looking forward to exploring these alongside Donnell. I wish I had time to speak of more of the women, but I'm going to end today with Monica Skeet, whose story is different again, but equally significant to my mind. Beginning my research with a newspaper advert in Barbados, I was soon able to identify both relatives and colleagues of Monica Skeet, whose writing I'd first seen and admired in Caribbean school textbooks. As with Kathleen, next one please, thank you. As with Kathleen, Monica Skeet's historical imprint as a writer has survived largely thanks to her niece, Myrna Martineau, who inherited her aunt's papers and shares her love of books. Myrna has been an amazing companion researcher and has shared valuable family records and photographs to help me reconstruct Monica's writing life, as well as a number of unpublished stories and other works. Disappointingly little remains on record to help build insight into Skeet's authorial identity, despite the fact that we know she remained committed to writing throughout her life. Yet the body of her written work that remains indicates both Skeet's talents as a writer and the fit of her work to the writers of her time, who remain well known and widely read. When Myrna delivered the eulogy at Monica's funeral in January 1998, she opened by noting that her aunt's modesty and disputing the self-effacing account she gave of herself. To quote, "She always said she was the unremarkable child of remarkable parents, but in her own way, she was a remarkable woman." My research certainly confirms that. Monica Agnes Skeet was born in Grenville, Grenada in 1923 and came to her father's home in Barbados in 1937 to enter Queen's College that same year. After graduating, she returned to Grenada for some time and in the late 1940s began sending her poems out for consideration. One was published in BIM in 1946 and two more broadcast on the Caribbean Voices programme in 1948. In 1951, Monica took a post as a teacher of English and history at her alma mater and began a professional connection that would endure more than 3 decades. But if one of the often cited reasons for the belatedness and sudden emergence of women's writing in the 1970s and 80s is their later access to education, particularly higher education, then Monica was exceptional. During the early 1950s, she became romantically involved with Harry Skeet, a young Bajan man with aspirations for a medical career, plans to study at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies. However, Harry's plans must have changed and he headed to London instead. In 1955, Monica also sailed for London in order to take up her place to read for a BA Honours in History at King's College, University of London. It appears that Monica's economic privilege enabled her to pursue higher education in the UK without the extraordinary pressure of winning an Island scholarship, about which she would soon write. On the 22nd of September 1956, Monica Martineau and Harry Skeet were married at Holborn Registry Office. The certificate records the bride as a student at the University of London and her groom as a laboratory assistant. I found no evidence yet that she met with the renowned Windrush male novelists, whom also made the journey to London in the 1950s. But it is not out of the question, as they too were connected to Caribbean Voices, where Monica had already sent her work, and Mittelholzer was the programme's editor when Skeet's story, The Scholarship, was broadcast in March 1958. In that same month, the Daily Gleaner in Jamaica carried a short report based on an interview with Monica. With a catchy title, From Queen's to King's College, the story also mentions her literary efforts. When she isn't studying, Monica looks after her husband Harry, a science student, and just for good measure writes the odd ode and occasional short story. It's impossible to know whether the trivializing tone that frames her writing life reflected the modesty expressed on Monica's part when she spoke to the reporter, or whether her literary endeavours were reframed as an amusing pastime by journalistic hands. Regardless, the presentation of her writing as a secondary activity to wifely duties and her studies gives some indication of the gendered assumptions about the woman as writer that likely contracted the possibility of her pursuing ambitious pathways to professional authorship in the same way as her male counterparts close by in the metropolis. All the same, the notion of Monica's writing as a casual minor activity is undermined by her earlier efforts to be published, paid and recognised. And as the brief news item acknowledges, her achievement was not insignificant in that, to quote, one of her literary efforts earned Monica 10 hard-to-come-by BBC guineas. There is no correspondence from Monica to be found in the archives of the BBC Caribbean Voices programme or in the papers of Frank Collymore, the editor of BIM, but we know that she was connected to both and may well have sent more material than was published or broadcast. The QC magazine, Queen's College magazine from 1960, confirms that in this year, Mrs. Skeet returned to her post. While the rooting of female intelligence into teaching and nursing has been an established habit of patriarchal cultures, it's also significant to recognise that dedication to education in the Caribbean region was an intrinsic part of a wider commitment to cultural self-determination, a new model of learning and self-understanding. While my concern here is with her literary works, the conjunction between writing and teaching as it relates to cultivating a decolonised sensibility is important to note. A former pupil of Monica's told me how for A-level study, the teachers were allowed to choose the area of world history they taught. It was Mrs. Skeet alone who chose Latin America. This gave her the chance to teach her pupils about Simón Bolívar, as well as the more recent history of Che Guevara and the Cuban Revolution, events that were not given a positive spin in the homes of most Queen College parents. In the late 60s, Monica was still writing and seeking a public platform for her work. 3 more of her stories were published in BIM, and she also read her work on Radio Barbados as part of Frank Collimore's literary programmes. All the same, it cannot be ignored that the structures and networks that supported professional writing careers appear to have been more inclined towards men. We know that Collimore published Monica's stories in BIM, and in the notebook preface to Volume 8, published in 1961, he makes direct reference to her as a short story writer of great promise and a teacher at Queen's College. Yet, despite this recognition, we can be fairly sure he did not mentor her in the same way as he did Barbadians Austin Clarke and George Lamming, possibly an indication that he saw professional authorship as a male vocation, or at least a more possible pathway for men. All the same, Skeet recognised and praised Collimore for his mentorship in her poem To Frank Collimore, published in 1973 in Savaku 7/8, a tribute issue to Collimore edited by Kamar Brathwaite. And the biographical note on Skeet in this issue, identifying her as, to quote, one of the cornerstones, suggests a clear sense of her place within the cultural scene, even if frustratingly little record of how her belonging played out remains. Monica's only collection of stories, Time Out, was published by Thomas Nelson and Sons in 1978, indicating that she was negotiating this publication in the same decade that she was networked with the small but significant grouping of the Caribbean artist movement active in Barbados from 1972 to 74. It's not possible to know if Skeet ever considered preparing a collection of her stories for a UK fiction publisher, such as Andre Deutsch, in the way that Naipaul presented Miguel Street. However, it seems likely, given Skeet's lifelong commitment to Caribbean-centred education, that she would have considered the Nelson Caribbean List an ideal venue for her stories. Time Out was published as part of Nelson's Authors of the Caribbean educational series. Unlike many literary works designed for the schools market, the volumes in this series had no paratextual framing, with suggested topics for discussion or further reading. Indeed, Time Out, a slim 70-page collection, presents the stories of a talented mid-century West Indian woman writer, with few clues of its explicitly educational context. Throughout this collection, Skeet's writing is skillful yet understated, and in each story, all of which are structured around an unforeseen turn, she renders the remarkable qualities and distinctive character of the everyday Caribbean lives of women and children. Skeet's stories can be read productively alongside those of Lamming and Selvon, and if it were not for the distance set between them by their production and marketing strategies of educational and literary publishers in the 1960s and 70s, I'm sure they would have been enjoyed by Caribbean adult readers and discussed by literary critics in the same way. Pondering Skeet's invisibility, I'm minded that, like Ada Kathleen, she was in London at the time that Ranchard described it as indisputably the West Indian literary capital. But it's hard to know if she was within that creative orbit, or to what extent it was being a woman that kept her at a distance. In part, Skeet's modesty may have contributed to her lack of profile. She wrote to represent the experience of Caribbean women and children, and probably did not want or need to be able to stamp her identity as a writer in the same way as Naipaul, whose every book declares he has followed no other profession. But most of all, Skeet's invisibility is a dereliction on the part of literary critics, and I include myself here, who've not looked at short stories published in school textbooks as equal material for literary histories, and yet I strongly would argue that they are. I'm almost out of time, and I just want to round up by saying that if what I've presented today illustrates the need to reconsider the gaps formed by the gendering of literary historiography as an ongoing critical imperative, then it's significant to note that there are so many more women writers of the mid-century to discuss. I've already found rewarding work by Grenadian Eula Redhead and Jamaicans Ines Nib Sibley and Vera Bell. But there are many others who are still glimmers of glimpses, and we need only to look just under the surfaces of canonical literary histories to acknowledge how many other women writers and works we might cherish alongside their male counterparts. And this is just some missing women just from Caribbean Voices and BIM. The Beacon and other publications offer way more. In terms of a wider argument around literary historiography, we need to acknowledge that the work of literary history can only happen by iteration, that each generation of critics embodying several generations within it, will deliver a differently fuller version. But we can support future quarrelling, a necessary good, by self-consciously not presenting our maps as if they are the ground, and drawing attention to the work still to be done. I don't want to underplay just how demanding reconstructing literary histories can be, how much time and exertion is involved, how many trips to libraries and record offices in real life and now online, how many second-hand book punts, how many seemingly fruitless hours deep in papers or online searches only to confirm absences, not mentioned, not known. But there are also so many positives to what we might call the slow criticism of recovery research. And these definitely include the surprising connections to be made in what Kelly Baker Joseph has coined the digital yard, through Wikipedia, Twitter, etc. And most of all, the collaborative bonds that form, because truly it takes a village to find a mid-century West Indian woman writer. My work to find these writers has been supported by so many, and in addition to the families already mentioned, I really need to end by thanking some of these people. The archivists and librarians, Lorraine Nero and Glenroy Tate, John Robert Lee, Winsome Hudson, Chantal Cousins, Takesha Parks, Jessica Marshall-Lewis, digital librarians Laurie Taylor and Perry Collins of the world-shaking D-Lock, and Grant Young at UEA, who taught me how to Zotero. Publishers, Jeremy Pointing of People Tree Press, whose classic series has made the map fit the ground far more. Tanya Batson-Savage here in Jamaica, and Polly Patello, who's publishing an A to Z of Forgotten Writers, which I'm currently editing. Vintage booksellers, of course, Andy Tate of Blackrock Books deserves special mention. Fellow academics, far too many of whom there are to name now, but gratitude to Ralph DeLeo for his Index of Public Opinion and Glyne Griffiths for his of Caribbean Voices. And of course, to those colleagues of mine who followed up on local leads, placed TV adverts, driven me to graveyards and to rum shops to continue my detective work. Antonio MacDonald, my partner in Grenada, Evelyn O'Callaghan in Barbados, Michael Buckner in Jamaica. My research assistants, Winston Minot and George Oliver, my family, particularly Jeremy, Max, Asher, Charlie and George, all who've been unofficial research assistants and supporters for a long time. More recently, and really crucially, my research funder, the Leverhulme Trust, and the members of my Caribbean Literary Heritage Project team, Marta Fernandez-Camper, Jen McDera, and Zakia McKenzie. I'll end now just by saying that if anyone wants to join the Detective Agency for Lost Caribbean Writers mid-century or any other time, or has any information to share on the scene of the crime, you'll know where to find me, and I'll be so pleased to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to call on Miss Lisa Brown from the department to offer the closing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Spencer. I want to thank those many persons, thank you, many persons who made this event possible. And I just want to thank Professor Donnell first and foremost for mentioning this great detective agency that sounds very much like a book lover's paradise. When she mentioned actual books, I was excited. I haven't seen a real book in a long time. So we want to thank Professor Donnell for that wonderful journey. And the journey will continue with further scholarship and further research. Thank you for always inspiring us. I think even though Professor Donnell looks to the past, she's very much carving a way for future scholars. And that is always an important contribution. Thank you very much. Thank you to Deputy Dean Roof for bringing greetings. It is wonderful to have you in our department, and we welcome you. And we're happy that we could have you face-to-face as well. We're really excited about this, and we thank you for bringing greetings. Thank you to my colleague, Isis Simaj Hall, for welcoming and introducing Professor Donnell. And there are so many other persons who are part of making this hybrid event a reality. Thanks so much to the Marketing and Communication Department, to the Mona Messaging and the Humanities and Education Faculty Office for promoting the event tirelessly and posting in the various places where people will scroll and see. Thanks to MITS for being here and putting it online to join so many of you out there with a few of us in here. Thanks to maintenance, to the electrical department, and also to the Mona library staff for facilitating this function. So many guests are here today, and we're just happy to see real people who are not behind screens. And we reach out to those of you in the virtual world, and we send hello. Thank you to our specially invited guests online and those in the room. Thank you to our departmental awardees, Kevon and Yashika, and to our ever-sturdy administrative staff, and you know, the hub of all our correspondents, to Mrs. Gordon Francis, Miss Jackson, and to Miss Eaton, Miss Whitney P. Eaton, who is the artist of everything. Thank you so much for this wonderful occasion. Thank you, Professor Baugh, Mrs. Baugh. Thank you so much for being here, and I thank you from everybody. Thank you.